finally on the roof framing. This is probably where I find the most fun. A lot of the times this can be a little bit intimidating for some people. However, I'm going to show you some quick, easy ways to figure out how to hand cut your own rafters, as well as install them onto your shed roof and get them ready to shingle. Okay, so what we're going to do next, guys, is I'm going to show you how to lay out your hand-cut rafters. So on top of that shed there, what we're going to do is we're going to put on a gable roof, which basically just is a roof with two slopes, one on either side. It's going to be an equal pitch, and the pitch we're using is going to be a 6-12 slope. So basically all that means is for every 12 inches over we go, we're going to rise by 6 inches. When we're laying out our rafters, typically what I end up doing is I lay out 2 at a time. So the very first step that I do is you want to make sure that your board is crowned up. So all I'm doing right now is making sure it's crowned up. And the idea for that is you always want it to be crowned up because, again, as snow and rain sits on top of that, there's going to be additional weight. So you want that crown of the board to resist the weight. So I'm going to crown both of these boards right away. Then, along the top edge of the board, so notice how I'm using the up arrow as the crown up. So this would be considered my top edge. What I'm going to do is along the top edge, I'm measuring the total line length, which I calculated to be 53 and 11/16. And I'm making a mark at that top edge of the board. This is from the center of ridge to the outside face of wall. Next, what we're going to do is I'm going to measure from this point further down the rafter to the calculated tail length. I calculated that to be 13 7/8. So 13 7/8. And right there. So I do a little flag on it just so I make sure that I can see it. So I'm going to do the same thing on the opposite board. I'm going to do it all together. So 53 11/16, 13 7/8. And then just to double check that I've done everything correct, I'm going to measure from the end of the board up to the final measurement. I've got 67.5. And it should be the exact same measurement. You see how I'm slightly off? So I'm just going to adjust it. That's perfectly fine. Now at this point, there's one of two ways to actually mark our angles on this. First one, the one I prefer, is using your speed square. So I come up to the top here, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw what we call a plumb line. So I'm using the top edge of the speed square, and I'm hooking it on the top edge of the board. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to slide it all the way to the end of the board. And where on your speed square it says pivot point, I'm going to lift up the one end of the speed square. And what I'm looking for is I'm looking for this 6 here. And that 6 represents 6/12. So once that 6 lines up with the board in behind, I'm going to draw from the pivot point the line. And this line here represents a 6/12 slope. Okay. So the reason why it's called a plumb line is when this is standing up at the appropriate height, this line should be perfectly plumb. So the reason why I know to use the 6/12 down here rather than the 6 up here or any of these numbers is just this little chart here. At the bottom of all speed squares, it'll say common, and that basically means this is a common 6 or a 6/12 angle. This here is used for hips and valleys, and then all of this here are your degree angles. So for a common roof, we're going to use this chart right here. Once you've marked the top of your board, what you want to do is you want to slide down to the second mark that you've made, and you also want to draw your 6/12 right from that point there. Now it's really important that you continue making your angles the same direction. You almost want to basically draw a parallelogram on this board. Then finally, come down to your third and draw your third plumb line. Now all I'm going to do is I'm just going to do the exact same thing on the opposite board. So first what we have to do is we actually have to shorten the length of this rafter by half the thickness of the ridge. So in order to do that, what I'm doing is I'm measuring perpendicular to the line 3/4 of an inch. And I might as well do both boards 3/4 of an inch. And I want to redraw that 612 angle on that line there. So this is now going to be my new cut line. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to mark what side of the line that I want to cut on. I'm actually going to just scribble this one out completely for now, so that way I don't make any mistakes. I'm then going to skip the second plumb line. I'm actually going to come down all the way to my third plumb line. And what I need to do is I need to shorten it the full thickness of the fascia. So instead of measuring back 3/4 of an inch, I'm measuring back perpendicular 1.5 inches for the full thickness of the fascia. Same thing, I'm going to mark on the outside of the board which side I'm going to cut, and then I'm going to scribble out the old line. Then finally I get to the second plumb line, and this is where I actually need to create a notch in the board so that this rafter can be easily fastened to the wall down below, and that notch is going to be called a bird's mouth. So previously I kind of calculated that I want to have a heel height of 2 5/8. So all I'm doing is I'm hooking on the top edge of the board, I'm measuring down the line, and what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to draw a perfect 90-degree angle at that point. So you can use your speed square for this. So all I'm doing is I'm using the edge of my speed square and I'm lining it up with the pencil line down below. Once it lines up and intersects with the pencil mark that I made, you can then draw a 90-degree angle from that. 2 5/8. Sometimes to get a 90-degree angle, it's actually easier to use the framing square. So all I'm doing is I'm lining it up with that pencil line, and then on the opposite side, continuing with that cut. So now I'm actually going to be cutting out this little tiny triangle on both of these boards. Okay, now when it comes to doing the bird's mouth cut, this is kind of why I end up using skill saws all the time on job sites. What I need to do is I actually need to come in and cut up to this little corner here, and then also the same thing along this line. And it's really, really important that we don't overcut this corner at all, because what ends up happening is we start taking out the structural integrity of this whole overhang. We just lose all strength of this board if we start overcutting. So it's really important to be careful while you're doing this. Now, when you run your saw up to these corners, you'll see that this board, or this little piece of wood, doesn't want to come out. And mainly because the skill saw has a rounded blade. It doesn't fully cut straight all the way through the board. So a lot of the times what ends up happening is I need to use some sort of straight edge cutting tool. All I have on site with me today is a Sawzall, so being careful with the Sawzall, I can make these cuts. However, a lot of the time I do end up using a handsaw because it's a little bit more accurate than the Sawzall. So as you can see, I've actually got a little bit of material still left in that corner there, and you definitely want to get that all out, because this little bit of material will actually hold the board out from sitting properly on the wall. So you can use the Sawzall, or you can just kind of use your knife just to kind of clean this out. But since mine's really dull, I'm just going to use Sawzall. And there you go, bird's mouth. So I've got my two rafters up here. All I'm going to do is I'm just going to try and test fit them right now. So all I'm doing is just making sure that I know that my calculations were correct, as well as I'm checking out to see if that all of my cuts look relatively decent. So all I'm going to do right now is I'm going to put in a temporary post on the end to help me hold my rafters up. So all I'm doing here is I'm trying to find center of the wall. So all I'm doing is I'm measuring over 48 inches. And I'm measuring 48 inches over, and when I did that, I found that this was the center. So all I'm doing is I'm taking an offcut, and I'm actually going to center this offcut over that board. So what I need to do is I need to measure over 3/4 of an inch, so that way I can actually install this temporarily perfectly centered. I'm actually just going to square this line across, and I'm going to put an X over the side that has the center line. So it's going to sit in something like that. Okay, so now that I have this guy in place, all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to install these rafters on the end of the wall, just like this. So all I've done is I've actually pushed the rafter all the way to the end of that bird's mouth, and I'm just tacking it down. That way I can actually go to the opposite side and install the opposite rafter. So once I've tacked the two ends together, all I'm coming up to the top to do is I'm just checking these lines here. I'm just checking to make sure that they look relatively good. I can see that there's really no gaps in any of the cuts, so I'm pretty confident that the measurements that I've got are correct, as well as all of my cuts are correct. Now that these are up, I don't need this here anymore. So the reason why we actually shorten the top of my board for the ridge board is because you gotta imagine what's actually gonna fit in here later. I'm gonna have myself a 2x6 ridge board, and the ridge board's gonna sit evenly between these two boards. So the calculations that I made were always going to be to the center of the ridge board. Now, the way I calculate them, what I end up doing is I actually want to imagine a line that runs down the center. And when we actually calculate the top measurement, it actually comes to an imaginary point like way above the ridge board here. So that's why when I start to do my reductions, I'm measuring off of it perpendicular, because that's how the ridge board actually meets that plumb line. So in theory, we only do half the thickness of the ridge board on this rafter, because we've got half being taken up on this side, and then we do the other half for the other board. So that's why I'm only doing 3/4 of an inch at the very top. The reason why at the bottom I reduced for the full thickness of the fascia board is because the calculation that I did was from the edge of framing to the outside of fascia, and that overhang is 12 inches. So by doing so, I've calculated a diagonal measurement all the way to the outside of this fascia board. But what I have to do is I have to measure perpendicular back on that plumb line that I made, the full thickness of this board, which is 1.5 inches. So that's why I've made this cut. All right, so if you don't end up having a speed square to mark out your rafters, it's actually quite simple to use your framing square. So what you need to do is make sure that you crown your board. I like to end up crowning the board away from me, just personal preference. The very first thing is what I want to do is I want to actually find my pitch on my framing square. So what I'm going to do is I want to find the unit rise on the tongue of the body. And the tongue is like the thinner piece of the framing square. So what I'm doing is I'm looking for 6 as my unit rise. Now, because I'm using the outside of the framing square here, I want to make sure that I'm using the unit line or unit run on the outside on this side. So because I'm always using 12 inches as my unit run for a common rafter, I want to make sure that I'm using that outside 12. So to actually use that on my board, what I'm doing is I'm sliding that 6 so it meets the outside corner of my board. On the opposite side, what I want to do is make sure that that 12 lines up with the top of my board as well. Once those 2 points meet, you can then draw down from the 6 the angle. And notice that is the same angle as that 6/12. So when using the framing square, some of the things that I use to actually speed up the process a little bit is the tongue of the speed or the framing square is actually 1.5 inches thick. And the reason why that's important is, remember at the bottom here, we actually reduce the bottom by the full thickness of the fascia, which is 1.5 inches. So all I'm doing is I line up the edge of my board with my pencil line below. I'm just going to mark the opposite side. And that gives me my 1.5 inch reduction for my fascia board. When I do the reduction at the top of my board, it actually makes it quite easy to measure perpendicular off the line. So what I'm doing is I'm lining up that pencil line with the edge here, and I can measure perpendicular 3/4 inch there. And what I can do is, rather than trying to hold and mark my my 6/12 just like this, what I can also do is I can measure 2 points, one at the top, one at the bottom, and I can line up the edge of my framing square and just draw the line. So at the bird's mouth here, what I can actually do is, without pulling out a tape measure, I can use the framing square to measure 2 5/8 while holding it in line with that pencil line, and I can already mark the little tiny triangle for my bird's mouth. When you go to cut your bird's mouth, this horizontal line here, you may have some difficulties trying to cut this. So here's some tricks on how to actually make this a nice accurate cut. Alright, so as you come to this board, what sometimes happens is, if you notice that you're off of your pencil line a little bit, rather than trying to correct the saw while the blade is still running in the wood, what I like to do is I actually back the saw completely out and readjust, then restart the cut all over again. So observe. So notice how, yes, the cut is a little bit off at the beginning, but the main focus is you want to have a nice clean cut at the end of your cut. Now, if you end up trying to readjust, what ends up happening is the saw blade will actually start to bend and it'll bind, and you'll have to really fight it to try and push it through the wood. And when you start doing that, your cuts don't end up coming out the nicest. So it's always good to just back up, restart, and just let the saw do its work. So because I'm cutting multiple of the same rafters, very much like any kind of small block, what I want to try and do is I want to create one really accurate template, and I actually want to try and trace that for multiple cuts. That way I'm cutting the same board every single time, and it does end up saving you time in the long run, because let's face it, laying out a rafter does take a little bit of time. So if you cut 1 or 2 very accurate rafters, you can easily use them as a template. So when doing this, you want to make sure that you're always making sure that every board has the same crown. So what I'm doing here is I'm lining up the top edge of the board, making sure that it's nice and flush. And I'm making sure that's flush all the way down the board. When it's perfectly flush all the way, what you can do is mark your first angle. While keeping your hands on the board, I will come down to the middle point. If you have to do slight adjustments, that's okay here. But once you find that right above the second cut here, that it's nice and level, or sorry, since it's nice and flush, I can then trace out the center of my bird's mouth. And then finally, you can come down to the bottom and mark the final cut. And now I have all 3 marks to cut an accurate rafter. Alright, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to lay out these rafters here. These rafters are going to be laid out 24 inches on center. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to start from the side that I laid out my walls from. I'm going to hook on the very outside there. And what I want to do is I want to center over a 4-foot mark. So I'm going to go 24 inches, 48 inches, 72 inches. Notice how we've got the 6 foot. And then we are going to have one on the end of the wall here. So I'm going to do the exact same layout on the far side. All right, so what I've done here is I've actually installed 2 rafters on either end of the shed. Now, the reason why I've done this is so that I can actually install the ridge board, which is going to sit up between these boards, and it's going to run front to back of this this shed. Now, in order to figure out the length of this ridge board, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to make sure that it accommodates my 1-foot overhang for everywhere. So what I mean by that is I need to know the length of my building. So the length of my building is 8 feet. And what I want to do is I want to make sure that this ridge board supports the fascia board, which is going to run on the outside of the roof there. And the fascia board is going to run at a finished length of 12 inches. So what that means is I actually need to make sure that the ridge board sticks past here by 12 inches. All right, so what we're going to do is I'm actually going to lay out and cut my my ridge board all in one go. Now, what I'm doing is I'm using a 2x6 for my ridge board just to give a little bit of added strength to the roof. For this board, you want it to be relatively straight, as well as you want to try and avoid any kind of bark on the edge. Now, I'm going to adjust for this up there, like I'll accommodate for this, but it makes installing your rafters much easier if there's none of this bark on the edge of your board. So right now I've crowned up my 2x6. Now, what I need to do is I need to make sure that the finished fascia sticks past by 12 inches. So, if you think about it, if I run a fascia board up to this, it would be 12 inches past the wall if I use this mark here. But instead, what I want to do is I actually want to clad a fascia board on the end of this board. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to mark 10.5 inches, and that's actually now going to be perfect if I have a fascia board that runs on the outside of my fascia like that. And this 10.5 mark will actually represent the outside of my framed wall. So what I'll do is I'll actually mark that all the way down. I'm going to scribble out this mark here. Now what I can do is I can actually pull off of this just like I did the walls up top. And remember, this is always going to represent the outside of the framed wall. So I'm going to mark along the top edge, 3/4 back from 2. Now at the end here, remember that the overall length of the entire building was 8 feet. So I want to make sure that there's going to be a rafter that sits directly on the outside of that wall. Now all I'm going to do now is I'm going to measure an additional 10.5 inches to accommodate for that fascia board, and this will now be my cut line. Okay, and I'm ready to install this. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to raise the ridge up between these rafters here. All I've done on the far side is I put a temporary block just to hold the end up, just since I'm kind of working by myself. So the nice thing is once the ridge is up in the area that it needs to be, the rafters actually kind of pinch it in place and it doesn't really want to move too much. So all I'm going to do right now is I'm just going to put one nail through the top of the rafter into the ridge board. And when I do that, I want to make sure that the top edge here is actually flush with the top of the ridge board. I'm just going to do the same thing on the opposite side. So as you can see, guessing isn't always the greatest thing, but at least it allowed me to get this ridge board up here. So all I'm going to do is just kind of pop this off. So once again, making sure it's nice and flush. I'm lining it up with the outside mark for the outside of my wall. And just until I make sure everything's 100%, I'm just one nailing everything. There. Right now, the ridge board's sitting pretty well in place. However, you see it moves quite a bit back and forth. So what I'm going to actually do is I'm going to set a level on top of this to make sure that the top of this ridge board's sitting nice and level. And what I'm going to do eventually is I will double check the measurements from here down to the wall, and it should be the same. If it is the same, what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut 2 blocks the exact same length, and I'm going to nail them up underneath here, and that will help hold the ridge board at the right height. So right now my ridge is sitting perfectly level. So what I'll do is I'll take a measurement here. Now I'll go measure the other side. So all I'm doing with this post here is I'm making sure that I'm installing it on that center line that I made on top of the wall earlier. And then all I'm going to do is I'm actually going to pull this ridge board over so that the pencil line that I scribed over earlier lines up with the edge of this board, because that's, again, the representation of the outside of the framing. Okay, it'll add a little bit of strength, and what I'll do temporarily in a moment is I will actually use a level, and I'll level up to this point here, and I'll put like a temporary angle brace on just to hold this from going side to side. So now the ridge is sitting up perfectly level. It's sitting on its post now. The weight is directly bearing down. What I'll do now is I will go back to the side that I laid out everything from. I will level up, or I'll plumb up that side and throw in my temporary angle brace. While I'm doing that, I will finish off fully nailing these rafters, since now that I see that everything now is sitting nice. So all I'm doing with this is I'm trying to create a 45-degree angle. It's just a very basic way of trying to brace this from side to side. Like you can see, it still wants to move quite a bit. So what I'll do is I'll nail the bottom down here so that it's out of the way of the exterior wall. And don't have to go crazy with nailing this, because this is just temporary. It will be removed at some point. And what I want to do, use my level, and I want to level up to the pencil line that I made on the ridge board. So all I did there is just some of the heads of the nails were just slightly holding my level out of the way. I just tapped them in. But you can see that I have to move in just a little bit. It's always good to double check your level after, or double check the plumbness or level of your object after you've tacked it for bracing. For some reason, every once in a while you're hammering or shooting with a gun, it does tend to move sometimes. So now by doing that, this thing doesn't want to move side to side at all anymore. And what I've also done as well is, this is actually where my layout is. So my next rafter is going to sit right there. So I can actually install all of the remaining rafters in place while this is still on. And I can actually sheet the whole roof while this is still on. So it's always going to be out of the way until the final project has been completed, I can take it off and it's out of the way for the homeowner to do with what he wants inside the shed. So basically what I'm going to do here is I'll show you how to properly attach the rafters to the walls below. So typically what I end up doing is I will do 2 nails in from one side on an angle, and then I'll have one go through the other way. And I actually want to interlock them, well, you'll see how I interlock them, but I want to make sure that they're not going to basically hit each other while they're inside the wood. I want to try and space it out so it'll eliminate the potential cracking of the board. So it's nice when the ridge board is up, because I can rest these up against the ridge board. And I actually, on smaller rafters like this, you can let go and they don't really want to go anywhere. So what I like to do is I like to pull it towards myself, so that therefore there's no gap in the bird's mouth at all. And as you can see that I'm on the pencil line, and I'm on the side of the pencil line that the X is on. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do 1 nail through on my right, and then what I'll do is I'll do 2 nails on the opposite side. I've kind of evenly spaced them out, and on the opposite side the other nail is roughly in line here. So on the next rafter I'll do the exact same thing. So I'll pull it towards myself, making sure I'm on my line. I'll do 1 nail roughly center of the bird's mouth, and then I'm going to space out the other nails. So when it comes up to the top now, what you want to do is you actually want to have it so that the layout is on top of the board. And the reason for that is I can actually sit here and I can see that the layout lines up with not only this rafter as well as the opposite rafter. Now you can actually see that this rafter wants to sit a little bit lower on my ridge board, and part of that reason is this ridge board actually bows very slightly to the far side. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to install the far side rafter first, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a nail in the top of it. I'm going to drive it towards myself, and it'll help push the ridge board towards me. So all I'm doing for this is I'm looking at that layout line that I've made. I'm going to put a nail straight through the top into my ridge board. I'm going to lift this up just a little bit. I'm going to hit the head of that nail. So it's going to hold itself out just a little bit, but what I'm trying to do is I want to make sure that it's nice and flush all the way around. So up here, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put the nail straight through the back of the ridge board into this board, and it'll actually help hold or help pull the ridge board over. So yeah, there is a little bit of a gap here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to throw a few extra nails through the opposite side to try and help pull the ridge board over. There, perfect. What I try to do is I try and put an even gap, if there is any gap, to either side, and then it doesn't really cause too much of an issue. Very first, I actually need to create my gable wall. So what I'm going to do is all of these studs down below here, I'm actually going to extend them up, and they're going to help support this end rafter. So the best way to do that is to use your level up and mark a line, or what you can do is you can actually measure over from your center post here and make marks on your rafter boards. So what I want to do is I actually want to make sure that the studs here have lots for me to nail to. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to cut a small rip to allow for the stud to sit in behind this rafter. So I'm actually going to take 2 separate measurements for this. And the first one is where I'm going to cut my notch, and my notch is going to be cut at 6.5 inches, and that's where this point is here. So all I did is I butt into the wall, measured up to the shortest point of my mark there. And I'm also going to cut the overall length of the block to 9 inches. Do the same thing for this one. 14 5/8 and 17 1/2. In order to actually cut this, what I like to do is I've got my 17 and a half inch overall length, and I'm actually going to cut this clean off at this point. So this is scrap material. But this here is that 14 5/8 of an inch. Now, what I like to do is I like to put a slight bevel on this board so that it fully sits underneath that, that board there. So in order to do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark my 6/12 angle. And I'm going from the short point, and I'm going to angle it all the way up here. Now what I also have to do is at this point here, I want to actually notch out 1.5 inches for that rafter along that point. So I'm just going to extend the 14 5/8 mark just so I can kind of see it. So cut the overall length. So there's my overall length, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do my rip cut first. Next, what I want to do is I actually want to turn the board up on its edge. I'll set the depth of my saw to 1.5 inches. You can finish your cut, and now that board there will sit perfectly up underneath my, my rafter. Okay, so let's go see if these actually fit. Yeah. So you can see that the bevel cut will actually sit directly underneath this rafter. We'll give it full bearing. And it actually gives me a nice nailing surface as well. So what I like to do is I nail it down to the wall first. And then what I do is I put one nail up underneath to allow me to drive the block all the way over. And you can see that I'm now on my pencil line. What I can also do is shoot through the back side, and it helps lock that all in. Sometimes I just need to tap it over a little bit, so you just hit the head of the nail. So it's perfect. So the reason why I'm doing this is I actually need to extend the plywood from the walls up onto the face here. So that's all I'm doing here with these guys, is I'm extending it up so I can continue the wall below. All right, so now that I've got the walls sheeted all the way up to the underside of the roof, what I can start doing now is actually install all of the fascia board. So the fascia board is actually going to stick out in line with the ridge that's sticking out at the top. It'll be running on the outside of that all the way down to the end of the rafters here. I'll take this block off, and I'll actually extend a horizontal fascia board all the way across. But what I'm going to do first is start with the ones that run down the slope of the roof. So for this, you can take a measurement of the rafters that are up there and recreate them. But since I still remember my measurements from doing my calculations, I'm going to stick with the calculations. So similar to laying out my common rafter, I'm going to mark out my 67.5, because that was my overall length, including the overhang earlier. So 67.5. Now at this 67.5, I'm going to continue doing the 6/12 angle on my speed square. Okay, so what's going to end up happening is this side fascia board here is going to stand up along the slope like this. Now, what's going to happen is at the bottom here, we're actually going to have a fascia that comes in and rests at the very bottom and help hold the bottom of the fascia straight. Now, what I need to do is I actually need to do a cut here on the bottom. And mainly for that is so that the fascia that runs into it doesn't stick below. You see how it slightly sticks below there? What I'm going to do is I want to do just a slight cut at the bottom so that this leading edge doesn't stick below. It's just kind of one of those things that if you were to do soffit underneath of your fascia board, this little notch here, or this little piece of the board will actually get in the way of you. Okay, so what I'm going to do next is I'm actually going to cut blocking to help support the fascia that runs down the side of the roof. So to have a finished 12-foot overhang, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to cut these blocks to 10 inches. And that's for the accounting of the fascia that sits on the end of these blocks, as well as it's for 1/2 inch of OSB up there. The ridge board that I left out earlier sticks it out 10.5 inches from the framing. But after that, what we did is we actually installed the OSB on the outside, which is roughly about 1/2 inch thick. So therefore, these blocks will be 10 inches. So one way to actually cut these pretty quickly using a framing square is, here we go. I can line up the bottom here with 10, and I line up the edge. Actually, I can actually kind of hook the edge of the framing square on the board, and I can draw my line. I can actually kind of walk this down the board to make multiple measurements of the same length. All right, so what I'm gonna end up doing is I'm gonna put a block that sticks out straight out from here, and it's gonna actually match the block up at the top here. So since this is part of a roof component, typically roof components are laid out 24 inches on center, so that's why I'm going to continue the same method with these blocks here. So I'm going to have a block that sits roughly about here and about here. So when I install this, what I want to do is I want to make sure that it's nice and flush with the top, and I also want to make sure that it's relatively square to the rafter. So this is something that I usually do by eyeball, but feel free to actually mark this out with your speed square. So this is something here that you will definitely appreciate, the fact that if you cut a nice square block with this, it'll make this whole process of installing the fascia a lot easier. Okay, so what I've done here is I've actually marked 1/2 on this block here. So what I'm going to do with my fascia board is I'm actually going to install it so that it sits 1/2 on the board, just like that. So at the top here, what I'm trying to aim for is I'm trying to aim for that 1/2 on this ridge board, as well as this top leading edge of the rafter. I want it to be in line with the top edges of the board. So what I can do is I can actually easily pull up on it, and now that I see it's 1/2 on that pencil line, 1/2 on the ridge board, I can actually nail it in. I'm probably only going to do one nail for now, just because it's not fully secure on the end. So I'm just going to temporary one nail it for now, and then when everything's all kind of installed, I can come back and fully nail this off and really lock it in. So I didn't discuss it on the other one, but all I'm doing here is I'm actually laying out the top of this this fascia board so that I can actually line up these blocks. That way these blocks stay nice and perpendicular to the wall. I also find it sometimes helps me install this board if I'm doing it all by myself. So once again, I'm lining up my layouts with my blocks. I put one nail in just because I gotta still make everything nice and tight. And then hopefully when things are all said and done, when I come up to the top, this can be nice and tight. There we go. So once again, we'll one nail this. I'll actually be able to tighten this up a little bit more, just because the end of the fascia down there is actually sitting up a little bit. So when I push down on it to install it to the side fascia, it will help lock this all up, and that's when I'll come back and fully nail all of this off. All right, so what I'm gonna do here now is I'm gonna install this horizontal fascia. So usually what I end up doing is I have a board that's longer than what I actually need here. So because usually I'm doing this by myself, what I'll do is I'll start in the center. And what I want to do is I actually want to set the height to the flow of the roof here. So what I mean by that is this block isn't going to sit right up to the top of this cut here like this. What I want to do is I want to have it so that when I sheet this roof, the plywood comes down and actually sits roughly about 1/2 inch in from the edge of this fascia. Now, you can have it so that it flows over and just hits that leading edge. That's perfectly fine. However, personal preference, I like to have it so it sits roughly 1/2 inch in, and that way the leading edge of the plywood doesn't stick past the edge of the fascia. So with this fascia, you want to make sure that's a nice and straight board. You want to make sure it's also crowned up. So this board's pretty straight. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start by installing it to the center rafter, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to install it to the gable rafters. I'm not going to install it to the side fascias, because actually, look at what I'm going to do is once it's installed and secured, I can actually move this quite a bit. I'm actually going to pull it up to the appropriate height, and this guy here is going to hold it at the right height. So what I'm doing is I'm taking a straight edge and I'm going to line it up so that the fascia board hits that roughly 1/2 inch in. And all I'm going to do is I'm just going to use one nail at this point. Next, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the two ends on the gable rafters. So again, roughly that 1/2 inch. So once I have these 3 points set with one nail, all I'm going to do is I'm going to run my edge down this board, and I want to check to see if there's still any kind of crown to this board. What I'm also going to do is I'm going to check to make sure that this guy here is perfectly level. So right now, this board doesn't run up or down at all. It looks really, really straight to me. All I'm going to do is I'm going to check it with a 4-foot level. If I have a larger level, I definitely would use it for this. So when I'm nailing these, what I try to do is I try to do 2 nails. I space them relatively evenly on the cut of the rafter. And what I want to do is the first nail is going to go straight in, but the second one I'm actually going to angle it slightly up so that it still catches lots of the rafter in behind. If I went straight in, there's a good chance that I can actually poke out the back side of the rafter, and then it's really doing nothing. Now on the end, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to push on this until I get it to the appropriate flow here. Just gonna tap this up a little bit. There we go. So once I have all of my rafters nailed, what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my eye down the edge of this board again. But rather than looking for any up and down curve to this board, I'm actually going to look in and out. And I might have to do slight adjustments by just tapping the back of the fascia out or tapping it in. All right, so now we're ready to start sheeting our roof. So what I've done here is I've actually pulled this sheet up right now. Notice how it's rough side up again. And what I'm doing is, because the overall width here is actually wider than the sheet, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to overhang on the right hand side here a little bit of the roof. And what I'll do is I'll install the sheet, and then I'll cut the sheet while it's in place. Now you can go ahead and cut this sheet prior to putting it on. This is just a personal preference of mine. Either way still works. So when I go to install this guy here, what I want to make sure is I want to make sure at the end of the plywood is half on a rafter. That way I can install another sheet of plywood directly beside it. I want to have it so that the back side of the plywood touches the fascia board here. So you can see that as I slid it down, it just touches now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tack it with one nail just in this bottom corner here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the opposite side and do the exact same thing. Once I have the two sides kind of tacked in place, I can then start nailing my sheet off fully. Now, if it's a windy day like this, what I would suggest as well is always start on the side that the wind is back to you. That way, as you're lifting the sheet up, it wants to land onto the roof. Whereas if you're working on the opposite side, the wind will always push the sheet back to you and you'll be fighting it a little bit too much. Now, when you start to nail this off, what you want to do is you want to have one nail roughly every 16 inches, basically everywhere. Now, when it comes to down at the fascia here, what you also want to do is you want to nail into the rafter as well as into the fascia. That way it kind of locks everything all in. So what I mean by that is when I'm nailing by the rafters, I'll nail in straight just like this. Now, into the fascia, I'm actually going to tilt my gun, or you can tilt your nails slightly so that they go straight into the fascia board. Now notice I'm actually going a little bit more than one nail per 16 inches. Usually on the edges of the board, I tend to do one nail roughly every foot here. Now, if I have a sheet that is going to butt up to another sheet, like on the end, just like this, what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to leave this whole edge not nailed. Main reason for that is sometimes what happens is the head of the nail will actually bulge out the edge of the plywood, and it'll stop me from being able to tightly fasten the next sheet of plywood up against it. So what I do is I will install the next sheet of plywood, and then once the two sheets are together, I'll nail that whole joint off all in one shot. So when I go to install this guy, what I'm actually going to do is we always like to try and keep factory cuts to factory cuts. So what I mean by that is this is the cut I just made on my skill saw. Now, I feel pretty confident that I can cut a straight line. However, it's never going to be as straight as a factory line. So if you ever see on the edges of the plywood where you see how it's painted, this one's red, sometimes they're blue, sometimes they're black. Now, if you see a factory edge like this up there, you might as well try and match the factory edge beside it. It just makes everything look a little bit cleaner, and it allows you to kind of keep everything all nice and straight. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to jump to the other side, and I'm actually going to utilize some of my cutoff here. So the last piece that I used, the offcut is rather large. So rather than just kind of scrapping it and saying whatever, I'm actually going to use it as my starter piece on the opposite side. Okay, so I'm ready to start installing my very last row of sheathing. Now, what I'm going to do is, because there's a 2-foot span here between rafters, I'm going to use these things called H-clips. And what they do is they help lock the sheets in. So what I do is on the bottom here, I hook it onto the bottom using the wider piece. And when I go to install the next sheet, it's actually going to sit inside this clip here, and it's going to help tie these together. And over time, the center of the sheets here won't sag due to them being tied together using these H-clips. So when I go to install this sheet, I always like to try and stagger where the ends of the sheets are. So what I mean by that is the end here doesn't line up with a cut down and behind it. So seeing that there's no cut here, I know that this is a good placement for it. Now, when I go to install these sheets, what I like to do is I start up on edge like this, and I get the leading edge of the plywood just into the little clip here. And then I kind of walk my way across, and as I start to lower it down, it wants to rest nice and kind of steady into those clips there. Now, notice how this sheet here is slightly back from the ridge here. It's really important that the sheet actually is cut so that you can nail into the ridge, very much like how I nailed into the fascia board below. Now, once I have a full sheet on there, what I'm going to do is I'm going to install the last sheet. The one thing that kind of sucks is because of offcuts, I was trying to use up as much scrap as possible. Now, I wasn't able to use factory edge up to factory edge. Now, one downside to that is all of the lines that are in this plywood no longer line up with rafters down below. So I have to basically eyeball where I'm going to nail. So to do that, what I'm doing is I'm looking at the sheet below, and I always nail near the edge of the board. And I can see that there's a rafter basically right here. So I'm gonna shoot a nail here. And since it's a short span, I can actually see the rafter on the other side. And the rafter on the other side is in line with it. So I can easily eyeball it for just the small space. Yeah, I'm ready to start shingling then.
For the next step in our How to Build a Shed series, you can click the video thumbnail on your screen now or check the description below for links.